Hello, everybody. If you're able to turn your cameras on, we'd love to see you. If you can't, we understand. Welcome to Making Connections, which is a new monthly four-part series on loneliness, co-hosted by Allison Gilbert and Reimagine. My name is Andy Engel, and I lead virtual public programs here at Reimagine. Since this series is all about making connections, tell us where you are and what drew you to this particular program. Please use the chat. I want to tell you a little bit about Reimagine for those who don't know. Reimagine is a nonprofit organization catalyzing a uniquely powerful community. People of different backgrounds, ages, races, and faiths, people of no faith, all coming together to heal ourselves, our communities, and the world. We support each other in facing adversity, loss, and mortality to transform life's biggest challenges into meaningful action and growth. Reimagine resources, support groups, events like this one today are free and accessible to the public. This is made possible by the support and generosity of participants like you. So for those of you who already made a tax-deductible donation when you registered for this event, thank you so much. Your gift will immediately support Reimagine's mission to help people of all walks of life transform the hard parts into purpose. Last month, we kicked off this wonderful series with Allison by having a conversation with a number of luminaries. We had U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy. In addition, Allison interviewed Dr. Ruth Westheimer, your favorite sex therapist and mine, who is serving as New York's ambassador for loneliness. And she's co-writing a book with Allison on this topic. Our third guest was Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstad, who directs the Social Connection and Health Lab at Brigham Young University. So we have all of these recordings on our site in our video library, so please check those out if you missed those. And you can register for the remaining programs in this series, and it's through June. It's generally the third Thursday of the month. Nicole Tan, my colleague, will paste a link in the chat so you can access the registration and the past recordings. Before we begin, I want to share a few Zoom tips with you. You can view the live transcription by clicking on the CC button at the bottom, and you can save the chat, and I hope you use the chat with all of your questions by clicking on the three dots within the chat window. Feel free to send me or Nicole a private message in the chat. If you're having any technical difficulties, we can try to help you. Okay, and now a few words about Allison Gilbert. Allison is a longtime Reimagine collaborator and host. She is the author and co-author of numerous books, including Listen World, How the Intrepid Elsie Robinson Became America's Most Read Woman, Past and Present, the namesake of her other series with Reimagine, and Always Too Soon, Voices of Support for Those Who Have Lost Both Parents, like Allison. You can follow Allison on Instagram, X, and Facebook. She's everywhere as A. Gilbert Writer. And now it's my pleasure to hand this over to Allison to introduce our very special guests.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you, Reimagine. Every time I come with you and together in community with you, I feel lucky. And so I invite you just for the next hour to really dial in with us today. For me, that means turning off my phone and not looking down at my texts or emails during this conversation. I invite you to do the same so you can really just be here, and there'll be ample time to ask Leslie and Megan or me your questions. And so that's an invitation. Andy invited you to turn on your cameras. If you're in a safe place where you feel it's okay to do so, part of making connections is eye contact. I am learning so much from working with Dr. Ruth on this new book called The Joy of Connections, that eye contact, seeing people, looking at our facial expressions, allows us to feel a sense of calm and warmth and togetherness. So if you can, I know for me, I would love to see your faces. 2 bits of housekeeping before we begin. Last time we were together, I mentioned about this new book, The Joy of Connections, and I could now show you the cover. So here it is, The Joy of Connections with Dr. Ruth. Hooray! So it's coming out in October, and I can't wait to keep sharing more and more with you. The second bit of housekeeping is that Megan and I happen to be at this incredible place in Massachusetts called Kripalu. It's a yoga center where you get to just be and relax. And if you want to write while you're here, you can write while you're here. If you want to hike while you're here, you can hike while you're here. Or, of course, do yoga. The reason why I am mentioning this to you today is that Megan and I are here for free. We have not paid a dime. Kripalu offers scholarships. You can apply. If you are in service of any community, whether you are a teacher, whether you are a hospice worker, a grief therapist or counselor, if you are in a position of helping, Kripalu wants you to come here to rest. Because if you rest, you're going to be re-energized to keep on helping other people. So with Kripalu's asking and with their permission, they want me to tell you about this incredible opportunity. So the link is in the chat. Come here. It's free. It's amazing. And I just wanted to tell you all about it. Okay. Those are my housekeeping notes. This conversation is really important to me. Andy mentioned that I've lost both of my parents, and so grief is something that I have been long considering, long thinking about. But it's only recently that I began to actually reflect on how grief caused me personally a great deal of loneliness. I was not thinking about grief in terms of how it made me feel isolated or other, cut off from my peers. It just wasn't in my vocabulary yet. And so with this conversation about loneliness, and if you don't know, the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, proclaimed it an epidemic in this country last year. So if you're joining us today because you are feeling alone, then you're in the right place. You're not alone. I'm going to do something unusual, and when I talk to Megan and Leslie, I'm not going to bore you by reading their bios to you. Their bios will become evident as I ask them questions, because I think that's how we'll have a richer conversation. We will open it up for questions. So please, at about the half-hour mark, make sure you've written down something that you want to ask Leslie or Megan. This is your time, and we're going to turn it over to you when you have those questions. So these are the preeminent experts about grief, and of course, so many of the ripple effects of grief, one of which is loneliness. So get your questions ready, because something made you want to come today, and I don't want you kicking yourself when you walk away and you haven't asked that question. So Leslie Gray Streeter, I would
Yes.
like to talk to you, my friend, first.
Okay.
You are the author of Black Widow.
I am.
I can't raise it higher or else it'll disappear. So it goes right to my chin. And that's
Perfect.
about it.
Perfect.
When I was doing the homework and digging into your background, which I'm of course familiar with, but of course doubling down on my research to prepare, I was struck by something on your website.
Oh,
You have a very brief description, not your whole bio, but a very brief description. And here is what you chose to write about yourself.
mhm.
In part, you say, I am a writer, a mommy, a widow, and a darned good friend. Now, you could say many things about yourself, Leslie, as we all can. But the fact that you describe yourself among the first and foremost as a good friend in this season of loneliness that we are talking about, I have so many questions. Why is that
It's
such an important identifier to you? And help us understand that a little bit.
it's important because I think it has been verified by the times where I thought I was a good friend and I wasn't. Because, just like when people say I'm an ally, right? You can't really say you're an ally. The community to whom you are offering allyship has to decide that you are. Just like I've always considered myself a good friend, and there are times when I have had feedback and wasn't just people who were being disagreeable, but where I thought maybe that wasn't what that person needed. So what I try to do by being a good friend is to listen to what my friends need. If you decide as an ally, it goes back to that example to say, I have bestowed upon the little people of X community all of my wherewithal and my benevolence. And they're like, we didn't ask you for that. And I say, as a good friend, I want to give you what I want to give you. And they go, but that's not what we need. I think that I learned from my friends who are amazing friends, and I have a huge village of friends that are lifelong friends. Um, I have tried to say, I want to be the friend to them that they are to me, and I want to turn back on to them what they have given to me, because I would not have survived any of what I write about and beyond without my friends.
There's two things about what you said that I want to just pick apart before I introduce Megan Reardon Jarvis, because I have a whole host of questions for her. But for this part, what you're describing is two things I think are really important. I want to kind of highlight it with yellow highlighter. One is
Yeah.
that what you think your friend needs is not being a good friend. It's like what you're listening, what you're observing, what you are. It's like it's not your agenda. It's really almost being a mirror as opposed to someone projecting. So that's number one. And then number two, which I love as well, is that you have been such a good friend. And I know from working with Dr. Ruth, there's an upside to being a good friend. It makes you feel more joy and more happiness. So when you are feeling alone and isolated, to then reach out and be that good connection for someone actually lifts us up. Yes?
I absolutely believe that. I have a friend who is in her 60s who is single, has been single her whole life. Well, she was married briefly, but that wasn't a good situation, and has always dealt with loneliness. And the pandemic was incredibly hard for her because she was isolated alone. I was isolated with a kid and my mom. And I was also, promoting a book that very quickly went online, and we're doing all this stuff. So I had too much connection at some point. And it sounds very snotty almost. It's like, oh, I have too many people interested in my life. But I had to remember that there were people who need you to connect with them, and sometimes I would be like, why is this person always? It's because they didn't have anybody and they needed that. And just to get over yourself and say, what is it about me that I wouldn't maybe pick me, but I'm glad that they did. I'm glad that they reached out to other people and said, it's hard to say, I need to connect you because you sound needy or you sound stalky or whatever. There's nothing wrong with needing people. And in the society, we have made anything other than self-reliance something that's pathetic and something that's like, well, what do you mean? I don't need anybody. Of course you need someone. And it is brave to knock on the virtual door or the physical door and say, I need people. is a
I
huge
love that.
thing.
Vulnerability is so important, and which is the perfect segue to Megan Reardon Jarvis, who just wrote this incredible memoir, not the end of the hour. And if I go higher, it'll disappear. Magic, it's back. Here it is, end of the hour. And Megan, her background is extraordinary for writing a memoir about grief and loss. She is a trauma trained clinical psychotherapist who went through her own trauma regarding grief, which she will tell us about. But in so doing, so you can get a sense of how intimate this book is. I read it, loved it. But what's so interesting about Megan, when you talk about vulnerability, Leslie, is that sometimes we don't even know what we need. So it's great to ask if you know, but if you're unaware of what you need, I think that's where someone like Megan really comes into play. And what Megan has said, that despite the universality of grief and loss, people are too often what she calls avoidant, right? We're not talking about it. And the result is that people who are grieving feel even more alone, more isolated. And it's because of that she is newly designed. This is so exciting. I feel like I'm breaking news here, Megan. A new grief practice called the Grief Mentor Method. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand what the Grief Mentor Method is, and if there's any way to bring it around to feelings of isolation and disconnection while we are grieving. That would be the sweet spot for this crowd here today. I can't wait to hear more about it.
Allison, you're such a good friend and you're such a good moderator. And this is such a delight to be on here with Leslie. So thank you. Yeah, so my background being in grief and loss put me in a very odd space when my mother died suddenly, which is my book is about both of my parents dying within 2 years of each other, and my experience with my dad's death being maybe what grief people call sort of like typical grief, meaning it's just really, really, really hard. But the resources that you have around you, you can kind of augment them just a little bit and still stay on the regular path for life. My mother's death was completely the opposite. I had PTSD really quickly, and I had to check myself into the same facility that I had sent my clients for 20 years. So talk about, maybe walking the talk, talking the walk, whatever that is. And in that process, what I discovered, and I think this is true of anything that you sort of study from an academic experience. I have other losses in my life, but not other traumatic losses in this same way. I learned sort of in an embodied way, what the things my clients have been talking to me about for 20 years, right? Like when we use the word isolation, what I always picture is like the Unabomber in a shack somewhere, like you can't get to them and you can't get, that's not what we mean in grief with isolation. What we mean in grief and isolation is I could be in a room full of 100 people and my experience is so singular to me that I don't really believe that these folks can understand me, and I don't feel maybe safe to connect to others. So when Leslie was talking, what I was thinking about was, I don't think I have been a great friend for the past 4 years since my mom died. I really loved being the friend who showed up with the food and the balloons and the tissues and the stuff. And I was so overwhelmed. And when I say overwhelmed, I mean physically overwhelmed. Central nervous system wise, not being able to eat, not being able to sleep. And I had really strong narratives in my head about that I was sort of making up about the world and about other people that I really believed. And again, I knew what those things were because I treat those things. So in the process of all of that experience, I created something which I'm always like a little embarrassed to talk about it because I sort of hate things that are mnemonics, like the M stands for something and the E stands for something. But I also built this with my business partner, the Mentor Method, so that people had an idea of these 6 core components that actually people have told me for 20 years are really helpful in helping them manage their grief. I think it is wildly nuts that the primary resource we have, the 5 stages of grief, was never really intended for grievers, and then there isn't much else. So I'll just quickly run through it so it does. The M stands for mindfulness. So again, a word that I feel like, oh, it's very pop culture-y, but mindfulness just means being in the present moment without judgment. That's all it means. Being able to tolerate your own physical system and maybe be a little bit outside of the narrative. And that really is from my own experience. I had so many stories that were chasing me that the idea of connecting was impossible. E is about energy. If you read about how people should, do self-care, we equate a bath with taking a walk. But in my grief and the grief that I experience with my clients, there's a very big difference between people who are super anxious in a sympathetic nervous state. That's actually a different part of the brain than people who are sleeping all the time. So the practice, the grief mentor method, makes different suggestions based on what energy you're in. And then N is about nourishment. It's about what are you literally eating, because we grieve with our bodies. And so we need to, you can eat all the pizza you want, all the Doritos you want, but I need some macronutrients in there, some like green food. So what are your what's nourishing you, but also what nourishes you? Music, going to church, being with friends. I have worked with so many people that are so discombobulated by their loss that they can't remember what that is. And so we pause and we spend some time and really get connected. And what I love about the nourishment is some people are really driven to things they haven't done in years or have never done before. They want to go hiking and they're not really a hiker. They're picking up a violin from under their bed that they haven't played since high school. So I really love the nourishing part, but connection is in nourishment. Having an understanding. I always ask my grievers, do you cry alone or do you cry with people? Some people are in the shower, in the car, behind a closed door criers. I happen to be somebody who would be more likely to cry in a crowded restaurant with a person. So just kind of getting to know yourself and how you nourish yourself. And then T is translation. What is the story you're telling yourself about your loss? Is it one that you can live with, right? Does it paint you as a victim? Does it leave things too unopen? Is the story you're telling yourself causing you pain? And how have you come up with it? Additional pain. And then the idea of how are you talking to others about that? How are you telling other people about what has happened? The O is getting outside. We have all this neuroscience. I'm a little neuroscience geek about how important for our serotonin levels it is to get out in the sunshine and actually experience vitamin D, particularly before noon. And also thinking outside of your network. So when Leslie was talking, I was thinking about all of the friends that are not part of my network anymore in my grief. And I am not going to pretend that that is because they were the worst friends in the world. I was very unlike myself in my grief. And there were people who were not able to stick with me. And I say that pretty neutrally, but that continues, by the way, that continues.
I'm dying to know what R is. Yes.
R is ritual and rest. So when we're trying to think about how are we going to celebrate somebody's birthday or anniversary, or how do we create rituals and knowing yourself? It's not random. You're not going to copy what your cousin did. You're really going to put some thought into it and understand that often those anniversaries are days that we just survive. We don't get to have like a happy ending of perfection. And then rest. It's really energetically expensive to become a griever. It's like growing a new part of your body, and not just sleeping, but resting, building rest into the day so that you can experience that. So we teach that to clinicians, and so that's a new model that
So just again, so people, if you're writing it down, it's called the Grief Mentor Method. And if you go to Megan's website, Megan Reardon Jarvis, you can find it all there. I went through it today. I know it's up. I know you can dig in and read all about it. It's just, it's new, it's novel, it's innovative. I think it's going to be groundbreaking. It's incredible. Leslie, let me come back to you just for a moment. When you lost your husband, Scott, You were a really, really young mother. I think Brooks, your son, was younger than 2,
Yes. Yes.
and now he is 10.
Yes.
And
Which is funny. It's funny because people who read the book, they find it when they find it, and they're still in their brain.
Think
He's
he's
like
bitty.
3 or 4. I'm like,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
he's huge.
yeah. And he is just so cute. I was so happy to meet him that time when I was in Baltimore. My question to you when it comes to the conversation about loneliness, which really may help a lot of people if you are willing to talk about it. I'm putting you on the spot, which is
Do it.
intimacy. Intimacy after loss. We've been talking about friendships. We've been talking about relationships that are not sexual or romantic in nature. And many people come to the conversation with about loneliness because they don't feel like they have a partner, a life partner. And I'm just wondering, in these 9 years, what have
Yeah.
you learned about
I've learned,
connecting romantically again?
oh boy, I have learned that I wish that I had had more sex when I was married. Not that I didn't, but you have no idea till it's gone, and you go, "Damn it." Serious, you know what I'm saying?
That's
You go
real.
look back, like, because we were only married for 5.5 years. So I look back at times where I was like, ugh, I just went running. It's gross. And you're like, that
You
would have been
heard
a
it
good
on
opportunity.
Reimagine first.
You know what I'm saying?
Don't miss an opportunity.
There you go. You never know what you'll miss. But I wish that I had had more, not just the sex, but like, I mean, we were really good friends too, as well as being in love. So we spent a lot of time like taking road trips. I would kick my shoes off, and when it was appropriate, when he was driving, we'd hold hands, and he'd buy me what he called gas station wine, because it was wine from a gas station. And just like we'd like just be like laughing and just singing Eye of the Tiger and just all of that stuff and I called him boyfriend because he wasn't just my husband, he was like my boyfriend. He was someone I felt warmly about. And I think that we used to laugh when our friends in their 40s would go, oh, I can't find anyone. We felt smug about it. Like, well, we'll never have to date again. And here I am out here, on them apps doing that thing, but I'm 52 and not 44. So it's a whole situation. Um, I've learned that intimacy, because it took me so long to find someone, I found him and then I lost him, and that you can't take it for granted. And just because it happened so completely the first time does not mean it's going to happen again. I am beginning to see person. And I've had some relationships, most of which were terrible. Nothing that was really serious or going anywhere. But I had this very, very much an idea at first that I was supposed to be married again, because married was something I was used to. And I thought that would, not that there was any replacing him, but at least replacing that relationship. I learned that's not what I need. That's not what I needed. That's not what my child needed. What I needed was a slow burn. And now what I have now is a slow burn. I can say that because I don't think he's listening. So it's nice to have that. I also learned that there is no one size fits all. I know people who are widowed who have immediately inserted someone else back into, and they're mostly men, because men don't like being alone. So you hear this like, my mom died, and suddenly there's this new lady with a casserole, a week later, and that doesn't work. I've seen it not work. I've learned that intimacy is so hard because you built something and you have to start, like, all the blocks got knocked off the table and you have to learn it all over again. You got to build it. And this is a different person. And I'm older. I was 38 when I got married. I am now 52. I'll be 53 next week. I'm a different person. The things I liked to do when I was younger, like when we were dating, my friends had visited on South Beach, and we all went out to this stupid club where, like, you ate dinner on a bed. My knees don't work well. I'm not sitting on a bed. I can't be balancing
What's so
an
interesting,
overpriced.
Leslie, what I find so compelling and so on point about what you're describing is that you need to relearn what's important
Bingo.
to you. It's okay for that to change over time. You need to be comfortable and accepting of difference. What was is now not what is. And it's also, it sounds like, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, is just a re-identification of self.
Absolutely. And I think that all of us who have, all of us on this panel have experienced significant losses, romantic or, familial or parental or otherwise, but there's always a reexamination because you have to figure out what compass that person was in your life and what pole they were holding you up and how you readjust yourself to stand. And I think that certainly in an intimate relationship, you learn what you need and what you don't need. Very quickly, I would say there's a discussion happening on the internet right now about traditional wives and about, young girls going, isn't it neat to it's all these beautiful blonde women on farms with a gorgeous baby, have you seen this? With
Yes.
this beautiful dress, and it's never like yesterday. Someone was like, where's the picture where she's snaking the drain? Where's the pictures when she's like, cat poop? There's never any of that. So it's like your idea of what a relationship changes. And I think a lot of it's based on what your reality is. And that's not, those women are rich and have maids. So, I mean, they're not cleaning up the cat poop. They're beautiful dresses in the sun, and that was never my life, beautiful dresses in the sun. And it certainly isn't now, neither would I want it to be. I like the hard stuff. I mean, I'd rather some nice stuff too. Nice stuff, please. But I'm used to the stuff, and the mess of it is what I like.
Dr. Ruth and I are deep, deep, deep into the research now. And one of the most important threads that have been really eye-opening to me, because she's the expert, I'm just the tag along, is that self, really interrogating self, is the key, or one of the keys, to, as she would say, beating back loneliness. That if we stay and we're stuck in old visions of what brought us happiness, the relationships that used to bring us joy, and that then prevents us from this redefinition, and then to secure other relationships, that can then exacerbate someone who feels incredibly alone. I want to turn back to Megan for a moment. In your memoir, End of the Hour, you really go there in terms of how bad things got for you. To be a therapist, to check yourself into an inpatient facility is just deep. And when I was reading about that in your memoir, I was right there with you. And as your friend, it was hard to read because I love you. And it was just, I didn't know you back then. And it just was a window into what you have been through. And I'm curious how you found community when you were at your lowest point.
God, it's a good question. I want to say this first for people who haven't read the book, that the deaths of my parents weren't tragedies. My parents were older. My dad was 80 when he died of cancer. My mom was 75 when she died in her sleep. I want to say that because the story of how it hit me, the fact that it was so hard for me, is not because something awful happened. And as a grief educator, I feel like one of the things that's really humbling about my experience, but also like illuminative and powerful, I think, is that we don't control how loss impacts our systems. So I happen to have a central nervous system that responds to things, my brain and my spine, I'm sensitive to temperatures and colors and all those things, but it was still really stunning how unbelievably disoriented I was by the loss of my mom. What it felt like was like I had been walking through my life holding like a tether to someone else, and then she dropped the tether and I spun around and was like, I don't know where to go. So the honest answer, Allison, and some of it was, it was almost like being ill. people attend to you in ways that you have no idea of. And so, the thing I am the most proud of in my life was my choice to check myself into treatment. But the way in which my community surrounded me, a lot of that happened almost like behind my back, and to the side and to the left of me. That some of the most beautiful things that happened, in the hours after my mom died were friends took my kids to get funeral clothes or called doctors to let them know that my mom had died. So I don't think I leaned into the community at that point. In the early, really fresh days of grief, it felt like I was sitting in a bed and people were coming sort of with offerings. Where I did start to need community was in that moment, right? So we have the terrible thing that happens. I always think of it as like a tree that falls across your life and you can't get over it and you can't get under it and you have to stand there for a while. I don't really think of it as stuck. It's just like I am not moving forward. I am with this tree. I am adjusting to the fact that it's here. But at some point, and you can't see what's ahead. The path that used to be isn't there anymore. At some point, you do have to figure out, like, what am I going to do? Am I going to stay on this side of the tree? Like, am I never going to do any more life? So when I was doing a little bit of life, I was leaning in to people who'd had parent loss before, but also, honestly, people who were just willing to look at me like I was going to be a little bit new. That they didn't assume that, one of the things that was the hardest is that like I could still shower. So I could like button my sweater. I didn't have anything physically about me that would indicate the storm inside of me. If you started to talk to me, you might get a sense. But I could really only be around people that were willing to not make assumptions about me. And so some of that was new people. I actually needed some people I had never met before. And so I did that in grief groups. I met authors, I started writing. I entered into a writing community, and that was really important. It was the bridge to change, and the change was becoming a griever, and I didn't have a choice, and I was becoming new.
I want to, as I did with Leslie, take out my yellow highlighter and just really bring attention to the incredible lightning bolt that you have just said for people to stop, listen again. Sometimes our own friends, our own family are not the people who are going to help us move forward.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need to look out of the normal, the usual, the typical, what we have had in the past, and form new connections. That's really important. What serves us once may still serve us again. It's not black or white. It's not binary. It's just being open to pursuing the types of new social connections for that new identity that we are putting on. So I love that. I'm looking at the clock and I know I want to get to more questions, but before I do, I want to make sure in the vein of connections that everyone can connect with Leslie and Megan even after we are done at 2:00 Eastern. The conversation will end here at 2 p.m. Eastern. That doesn't mean the conversation has to end forever. So Leslie Gray Streeter, you can find her Twitter, Leslie Streeter, or X, Leslie Streeter, Instagram, Leslie Gray Streeter. And it's, by the way, Gray with an A. Gray
Yes.
with an A. And then on Facebook, Leslie Gray Streeter as well. Megan, it's Megan with an H. Don't forget the H. Megan.Reardon.Jarvis. Oh my God, it's a tongue. Megan Reardon Jarvis with the dots, Instagram, and Megan Reardon Jarvis on Facebook. And of course, you guys know Reimagine, our co-host here today. I highly recommend that you follow Reimagine everywhere so you can get more programming notes and alerts. Let's reimagine on Instagram. Let's underscore reimagine on X, and reimagine end of life on Facebook. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that just because we're almost at 2, we have 20 minutes left, that we're not going to end. You can still connect with Leslie and Megan for sure, even after we're done talking here today. Leslie, I asked you before about what you've learned about intimacy since losing Scott. And I'm wondering how you found your people again after your loss. I know when you're in a couple, many of us have couple friends. And I'm wondering what changed in your social life as a widow. I'm sure a lot did, and how you recalibrated and those lessons that you have learned. So not into intimacy anymore, but now on the friendship level, what changed in terms of those relationships, and how can we all learn to pivot from your experience?
I think the biggest thing, and Megan said something really beautiful just about, you don't know what your needs are, and sometimes you need to find people. I needed to have to be around people who were not going to go, oh,
Mhm.
and who weren't gonna like thrust their own feelings of sadness. We never know. And the conversations all of the three of us have had separately about how no one knows what to say when people die. And so a lot of the uncomfortableness is trying to match other people's expectations or reactions. And so I think that I very much had a need to be around people. I need to be around people that knew Scott. And I got a lot of wonderful support from like friends of his from college that I never met, who told me stories, said beautiful things. And also sometimes I needed to connect to people who did not know him. Or like I rekindled a very good friendship of a woman I hadn't seen in years. And she met him once. We were all out watching a football game on TV, and we reconnected after because I desperately needed to be around someone who knew me, but who did not know me so much as a wife, because then she didn't associate me with being a widow. And so I think my very core group of friends remained very strong. There were a couple friends that kind of like went into the wind, and it's always the ones you don't know. But then again, there's always friends that stick to you extra close, and you didn't necessarily think that those were going to be the people that did that too. I have one of my very best friends. We were a couple of friends, but I've known her forever. We used to work together, and we become so much closer after Scott's death, even though the four of us, her husband and me and my husband, and we all hung out together. And people, I'm very good friends with Scott's best friend, who we all went to high school together, but I didn't know him very well. And he wanted someone to talk to, because he and Scott would like text 6 times a day. And he goes, "Can I text you about soap
Oh,
operas, about wrestling?"
Mm.
And I would go, "Yeah, man." And like he just went the other day to my son, who is now 10, almost 11, is starting Little League this week, and he needed a new bat. And Jason went with us to Dick's Sporting Goods, because I don't know anything about that, to buy. And I don't need a replacement. He doesn't need a replacement dad. I don't need a replacement husband, but we need our friends. And this friendship has become very special to me. And it's just a friendship. But it's more than a friendship, because he's like my brother. He's like my family now. And I needed that too. So I think you have to give space for relationships to become what they are. And like Megan said, sometimes it's disappointing. Sometimes they don't become what you thought they would, but hopefully they become the relationship that you need. And you get to the point where, I use this as an example, when you're I know this as a girlfriend, when you have girlfriends and somebody breaks up with her boyfriend, and for like a week, everything's about Jennifer, and you're like, "Oh, let's go take Jennifer ice cream and let's be there for her." And after about a week, it's like, "Oh my God, get over it." Or just not get over, but we can't just always be coming to Jennifer's house anymore, because now the rest of us have to move on. And you don't want to be that person who's always like, "I'm the downer. I'm
yeah.
here being my thing." But your really good friends will understand the points at which you need that ice cream and that let's watch some Meg Ryan movies.
I love the point about being proactive about your own needs, that if you used to be texting about a certain subject with someone and now they're gone, that you can be proactive and say, who can be that person for me again? I was just watching a panel discussion at South by Southwest this year. They had a lot of conversation about loneliness. And one of the speakers on one of the panels said that they are in a text group chat with a bunch of girlfriends who live all over the country, and they're professionally supportive of each other, they're personally supportive of each other, down to like, it sounds trite to say, should I wear these heels for my big talk or my big presentation that I'm getting, or did you hear this? And it becomes a body of, in this case, they were all women, of scaffolding, of just the girlfriends who have opted in to be the point people when it comes to whatever the subject matter is. I know for me, growing up, or watching my children's grow up, I should say, and not having my parents around, my point of connection is that I wanted to then beam with pride. Who was I going to beam in pride to without my mom and dad around? Oh, this is what your grandkids did today. I needed to have surrogate recipients of my pride texts, and it's to figure out who are going to be those surrogates for you. And so I appreciate that story so much, Leslie. Let me do this. We have a bunch of minutes left, and I wanted to bounce it over to Nicole, who I think has been going through the chat to figure out where the questions are, the ones that will go to Leslie and to Megan. So Nicole, what are the questions that have bubbled up that you want to make sure that Leslie answers and Megan answers? And thank you for going through the chat while we've been talking.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. We have a question from Jill from the beginning. I'm just gonna scroll up. Where's the question, Jill? I'll get back to Jill's question. We have one from Gigi. I'm going to copy and paste here again. On the
Is that the
screen.
one about anticipatory grief?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I can answer it. And Jill, I saw your question too. So maybe I can even stick an answer in there to your question at the same time. But, so we grieve with our bodies, right? So that is the filter, our five senses experience. We use our brain and our central nervous system in general. That is what responds to all the things around us. So if somebody suddenly comes into your house and slams the door, you're going to have a central nervous system response to that because it was unexpected. And I won't go through all the neuroscience, but there are things that enlarge inside your brain that cut off other communication that would typically happen. And so very quickly, the enlargement of the amygdala can shut down the ability of the brain to sort of keep the currents going on a regular pathway. The brain also sends information down into the body. So you can see very quickly how you can become what we call dysregulated. Dysregulated meaning you're having a hard time sleeping, eating, you're overly reactive. When you know that something is going to happen, like my dad was dying of cancer. Every weekend that I flew up to see him, he weighed less, he looked less well. I understood. I was learning. My brain was actually learning that he was dying. So the impact was not sudden. It did not cause my amygdala to enlarge and cut off all that circuitry and send all those terrible messages. It was still devastating. And that yearning and all that happens when you lose an attachment. But in terms of like the sudden impact, the way that I say is, with my dad's death, it was like drinking little sips from a cup of grief every weekend. And my mom's death was like being waterboarded. So in both instances, I took in a gallon of water. It's just, how did my system take it in? With my mom, it made me sick. With my dad, it didn't. So, there's a lot of things that can impact the system. One is, who is that person to you? Right. So I was also less close to my dad than I was to my mom. I called my mom every single day after I dropped my son off at school. Drop him off at school, turn in the circular driveway, call my mom. So the way in which I experienced the loss of her, also who she was to me, also really impacts you. So the question here is also about the mentor method. So the grief mentor method, you are the mentor. The way that the process works is you're a little scientist. One of the things that gets shut down in the body and the brain is kind of curiosity and your ability to experiment. So the mentor method says we're going to step right into that because you're going to need it. So what is your guess about what might help you? Start with what you know. You've always liked music. Let's start with music. Guess, that's your hypothesis. The second piece is experiment. Go make some, some playlists. I almost said mixtapes because I'm 50. Go make some playlists and see how that goes. And then if it actually makes things worse, this happens with yoga a lot. Everyone thinks that yoga is inherently good for you. But for grievers that are in that high energy state, being still can generate panic. So they'll say, I think yoga might be good for me. My sister said I should go to yoga. And what I say is, okay, here's something to know. There are different kinds of yoga, but go try it, come back and tell me. And if they say it was soothing and amazing, then it goes on the list of supportive activities that become part of our grief practice that the mentor method is trying to help us with. If it gave me a panic attack, we go back to the hypothesis. Okay, we want to do something physically active. It's not going to be yoga. What can we try instead? So yes, the question about does the central nervous system, it's not all one thing. Getting hit by a frying pan like they do in the Wile E. Coyotes is what it felt like with my mom. With my dad, it was more like slipping into a cold bath.
Leslie, there's a question here for you from Teresa Wilson, and she's talking about the kinship with you, BMW, Black, Mexican, and white. And I actually had a question for you that is related-ish. And so I thought I'd jump in and kind of go into Teresa's question. My question to you is, when you wrote Black Widow, and I've asked you this before in another setting, help us understand what it is about Black grief that you feel is different. And I would ask you, is there an equally unique conversation to be had about loneliness and being Black?
I think, and I always preface and say I am a Black person, not the Black person. I have a Black experience, not the Black experience. My Black experience growing up in terms of understanding grief was a religious Baptist Black experience where we went to funerals very young and where the casket was open and where there were discussions. Kids were not excluded from these conversations. It was part of what happened. And because there is an understanding religiously that this is the next step to your afterlife and all of this, and that person's in a better place and yada, yada, yada. So that assumption comes with, this is bad, but there is a silver lining to it per se. Like I said, that is not everyone's experience. That's certainly not even everyone's reaction to that experience if you have it. I think that the difference between, say, my family and friends of mine who were raised kind of waspy or who were raised Jewish, like for instance, my husband was very much like, what is this open casket thing? Like, or I had a friend who texted me who was like, I don't understand. I'm going to the funeral of a very close person to me who was Black. Why is it so long? What is happening? And that the traditional Black experience is that there's crying and wailing and, oh, Lord Jesus, why? And aunt trying to jump into the casket and just, that's very stereotypical Tyler Perry thing, but it's happened at funerals I have been at. It's nuts. And once again, that is not everyone's experience, but there is traditionally in that way an understanding. So I would read things about grief that were normalized from a mainstream, i.e. white perspective about things, a Protestant and or secular perspective that said, everybody's so closed up at funerals. I'm like, not my funerals, not with aunts are passing out in front of the casket and have to be carried out feet first.
So what do you do in that situation if you're feeling lonely and that's a similar experience, or grief and that's a similar experience? Where do you go when you don't see yourself and your needs reflected in the literature that you're coming across?
Well, I wrote my own book. I've said often that I wanted to write the book that I didn't have. And there are now other books. Is this like Timby Locke's beautiful book, From Scratch, and she has different experience as well. But there is, like, in that book and in the beautiful mini series, everybody's talking over each other. You can't get people to stop talking about it. You can't get people, her family's like that. His family, not so much. But it's a very different thing. I think that you seek your community. Like Megan has said, you find your people, you seek your people, and you seek people. Like, it was helpful to me to find people, other people who were Black, who had been widowed. And Teresa, so sorry for your loss. It was helpful to understand that everyone, even at the same funeral, wasn't coping the same way I was. His family was like, they're used to, like, it's a half an hour Jewish funeral. It's, you're in, you're out. And the family, my family's used 2 3-hour funerals. So when everyone kept filing in, they kept wanting to see the body before they closed the casket. And the poor funeral home guy is like, who are these Black people who keep coming by to see the thing? We're like, so sorry, hang with us, we're good. But I think finding people whose experiences are like yours, whether it's racial, or whether it's religious, or whether it's just the way that you like doing things, finding people who don't say that there's one way to do things. And I found that as a Black person, being able to express that and to say this is normal, whether or not this is your experience, it's the experience of me and so many people that you know and love. It's not weird. It's not weird. It's just what I am used to and what you're used to.
I love that. But it takes effort, right? You have to go pursue these opportunities. There was a question that Megan's been responding to about if you don't live near, you're in rural settings. And let me just say, we are in a fabulous time to be a griever. There are so many wonderful resources. I'm not saying they're perfect, and I'm not saying they're ubiquitous. I'm just saying that they exist and they're more plentiful than they were, let's say, when I lost my parents so many years ago. There are online platforms that, regardless of where you live, you can access really good content, video, printed, otherwise, that can make you feel supported. There are many resources, of course, Megan's website, of course, being one, Leslie's website being one, my website being one. Reimagine has all these programs, of course, that you should take advantage of. Other websites that, regardless of where you live, For Grief is a great website. Modern Loss is a great website. What's Your Grief is a great website. Claire Bidwell Smith, great website. Hope Edelman, great website. I can go on and on and on. And I think it takes the energy and the inclination to go search. And we are so lucky to have Google at our fingertips now, that we can find these resources. And so many of them, by the way, are free of charge, like what Reimagine offers. So I'm feeling actually buoyed by what is available to those who are in the most rural communities. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying it's there if you want it, if you want to go look. Before we go, we have 2 minutes left. To me, this time is sacred. We asked for you guys to put on your cameras if you felt safe. I have loved seeing so many nodding heads. It makes me feel like I have had the privilege of connecting with you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for having your camera on. It has filled my heart. Come back next month for the 3rd installment of the Making Connections series. It's my honor and my privilege to be taking on the loneliness epidemic in this way. Again, Megan Reardon Jarvis is a trauma-trained clinical psychotherapist. What you have heard here is the real deal. Her memoir, End of the Hour. She has another forthcoming book coming out in October called Can Anyone Tell Me? And I'll say, please, can anyone tell me, please? Essential questions about grief and loss. She talked about the grief mentor method. Go to her website. Please find out more. She's also the host of the Grief is My Side Hustle podcast. Leslie Gray Streeter is a columnist for the Baltimore Banner. I don't think we talked about her journalism street cred, but she is. She's the author of Black Widow. She is also a co-host of a podcast called Fine Beats, as in musical beats, Beats, and Cheeses, with her twin sister, Fine Beats and Cheeses. It's amazing. And she has a forthcoming novel coming out as well. Look for that too. I'm Allison Gilbert. I am grateful for your attention. I am honored by it. Stay connected with me on social media too, and I will look forward to being together again next month. So thank you so much.